February 1976. A grainy photograph reaches the British press, and according to reported accounts, the image helped trigger Prince Philip's fury. Princess Margaret's private escape had become public evidence the palace could not easily contain. The image showed Margaret on Mustique, with Roddy Llewellyn, a younger man who was not her husband. She was still married to Anthony Armstrong Jones, Lord Snowdon. That was the danger. Not romance alone. Not embarrassment alone. Proof. For years, the Windsors had survived private unhappiness by keeping it behind palace walls, careful statements, and the assumption that the public did not need to see everything. Once the photographs reached the British press, Margaret's rebellion became paper, ink, headlines, evidence, fallout that made quiet containment much harder. Prince Philip's reported fury is often treated as simple disapproval. But Philip was a duty-first operator inside a monarchy still learning how to survive modern media. Read through that public role. The danger was not merely that Margaret had broken convention, she had broken discretion in public. So the question is not who she loved, it is what, exactly, she had broken. What Margaret broke was not written down. It worked because everyone around the crown understood it. Private disorder could be managed. Public proof could not be unseen. So yes, the names matter. Roddy Llewellyn, Lord Snowdon, Peter Townsend, and the more disputed names around the edge will appear in the right category. But this is not a lover dossier, and it is not a promise that every palace whisper can be proved. The stronger story sits on a physical object, a newspaper page. A strained marriage could be softened with separate holidays, careful smiles, and silence. Gossip could be outweighed or denied. A photograph in print was different. It could be clipped, reprinted, passed across a breakfast table, raised by critics, and understood by people who had never followed royal rumor. So the evidence has to stay layered once. Confirmed, the Mustique photographs were published, Margaret was still married, and the Snowdons divorced in 1978. Reported biographical accounts, memoirs, and palace reaction. Disputed, darker stories around Margaret's wider circle, useful for understanding fear, not reliable enough to carry the case. Margaret was not dangerous simply because she wanted freedom. She became dangerous when that freedom acquired witnesses, images, and headlines. Philip, shaped by service and survival politics, appears to have read that visibility as a threat to the machine he believed had to endure. To see why they collided, we have to go back, not to Mustique first, but to their different positions inside the Windsor family. Margaret occupied one of the hardest royal positions, close enough to the throne to carry its glamour, too far from it to command its purpose. She was the Queen's younger sister, the bright figure beside the sovereign in photographs, ceremonies, balcony appearances, and magazine profiles. Press cameras loved the clothes, the friends, the wit, the boredom. Unlike Elizabeth, Margaret did not inherit the central duty that gave scrutiny a constitutional reason. She had visibility without ultimate authority, privilege without the final job. That made her useful and vulnerable. A glamorous princess could soften the crown's image after war and austerity. But the glamour had to be controlled, because she was also a public symbol of royal conduct. Philip came at the problem from the opposite direction. He had married into the system, surrendered his naval career as Elizabeth's reign began, and spent decades trying to make the monarchy look functional in a changing country. The record shows him pushing television access, tighter organization, and a royal family that appeared active and relevant rather than sealed behind gates. Modernization did not mean looseness. For Philip, adaptation appears to have meant discipline. The family had to look useful, serious, and controlled. It could not defend itself like a private household. Its authority depended on ritual, service, and public trust. By the 1960s and 70s, that bargain was under pressure. Post-war Britain was less deferential. Newspapers were bolder. Parliament and civil list coverage gave critics a public place to ask what royal privilege was for. So Margaret's private life was never entirely private. Her romances, parties, and absences from the official script touched a larger public image. Pain could stay behind palace gates. Exposure moved through cameras, papers, and political argument. Mystique was not the first collision. Long before the island, Margaret had learned what happened when desire met palace control. That collision first took shape in the tightly managed world of the 1950s court. Margaret had fallen in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a decorated RAF officer who served in her father's household. He was admired, disciplined, and trusted, but he was divorced, and for the Queen's sister, that turned a private attachment into a constitutional problem. The monarchy was bound to the Church of England's teaching on marriage, to cabinet advice, and to the memory of Edward V, whose abdication for Wallis Simpson had nearly broken the institution only 2 decades earlier. Margaret was not the sovereign, but she was near enough to the throne for her choice to matter. In 1955, she announced that she would not marry Townsend. The statement was controlled. The cost was not. Townsend taught Margaret that royal love was judged not only by feeling, but by what it might do to the crown. Her 1960 marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones seemed, at first, to repair the story. He was a stylish, modern photographer, later created Lord Snowdon. Their wedding offered glamour without abdication, and modernity without open defiance. Margaret could be vivid and still safely inside the royal script. Respectability did not mean happiness. Biographical accounts describe the Snowdon marriage as increasingly strained, marked by distance, bitterness, and reported infidelities on both sides. For the palace, the key point was not that the marriage was imperfect. Imperfect marriages could be absorbed by staff, softened by silence, and hidden beneath public appearances. What could not be managed so easily was proof. A visible fracture invited newspapers to narrate the marriage for the public. Once that happened, Margaret's life stopped being merely painful. It became evidence against the family's claim that discipline and sacrifice justified privilege. Before Mystique, the pattern was set. Townsend showed Margaret that desire could be overruled by duty. Snowdon showed the palace that a failing marriage could survive only while the image held. The next question was where Margaret could go when London itself had become part of the cage. For Margaret, the answer was not another room inside the palace system. It was Mystique, a dot in the Caribbean far enough from London that the old rules seemed to loosen. Mystique was small, private, and socially unusual. It was not a royal estate or a government residence, and it was not built around uniforms, equerries, and scheduled appearances. Aristocrats, wealthy friends, artists, and celebrities moved through a looser world, protected less by constitutional habit than by money, discretion, and distance. That distance mattered. In London, every dinner could become a signal, every absence could be noticed, and every guest list could move through the palace system before reaching newspapers. On Mystique, distance and water did some of the work palace walls usually did, but that was also the weakness. The palace understood castles, courtiers, press offices, and domestic protocol. It was less able to manage a private island social circle where glamour attracted attention, visitors came and went, and privacy depended on people choosing not to look closely. This is where Roddy Llewellyn enters the story. He was not powerful in the royal sense. He was a younger man inside Margaret's Mystique world, and biographical accounts place him at the center of the relationship that became public in 1976. The age gap mattered to newspapers. The failing Snowdon marriage mattered. But the relationship became institutionally dangerous because it crossed from rumor to image. Mystique became the escape route and the exposure point at once. It gave Margaret a version of freedom London could not offer, but created a control gap the palace could not close from Buckingham Palace. Then the gap produced photographs. Distance stopped protecting her. It delivered the scandal back to Britain. Once the photographs appeared, the story changed shape. The surface version was simple. Princess Margaret had a lover, and Prince Philip was furious. Inside the Windsor system, the more dangerous fact was not the relationship, it was the proof. A private affair could be denied, softened, or allowed to fade into drawing room gossip. A photograph could not. Once Margaret and Roddy Llewellyn appeared in the press, the palace was no longer managing whispers about a difficult marriage. It faced a public object, something readers could hold, pass across a breakfast table, and judge for themselves. The damage moved in a sequence the palace could understand. First came the private escape on Mystique, then the camera, then the newspaper page, then the public question. Why was a publicly funded royal household asking for deference while one of its most visible figures seemed to live outside the discipline the institution preached? For Philip, that was the breach. His adult royal role had been built around usefulness, restraint, modernization, and survival. He knew monarchy in post-war Britain could not rely only on inherited reverence. It had to perform seriousness. It had to look controlled. Margaret's photographs made control look like an illusion. They exposed not only a marriage in collapse, but the limits of palace authority. Humiliation, once printed, moved faster than any private explanation Buckingham Palace could offer. Philip's reaction makes most sense as institutional alarm. The camera had done what gossip alone could not. It made discretion fail in public. Once that boundary broke, the next palace fear was obvious. What else might surface? That question opens the most dangerous layer of the story, the layer where the evidence has to be handled carefully. Around Margaret's Mystique years, the press did not stop at Roddy Llewellyn. Her wider social world became an open hunting ground. Island friends, party guests, aristocrats, celebrities, and people who looked, to palace officials, far less controllable than the old court circle. One name in later accounts and media retellings is John Bindon. Bindon was a London actor with a violent reputation and reported underworld connections, and some stories place him near Margaret's social circle. But proximity is not proof of an affair. The most dramatic versions, compromising photographs, blackmail threats, or intelligence services intervening to retrieve material, remain disputed, thinly sourced, or unproven in the public record. That distinction matters. Treat every later rumor as fact, and the evidence disappears into tabloid fog. Ignore the rumors completely, and we miss the atmosphere of fear around Margaret's visibility. For a royal household already shaken by the Mystique photographs, even the possibility of risky associations mattered. A princess did not have to be proven guilty of every allegation for the institution to see a security problem. She only had to appear vulnerable to photographers, gossip columnists, hangers-on, or anyone who understood that a private image could become leverage once it reached a newspaper desk. So the Bindon and MI5-related stories belong in the disputed column, not at the center of the case. They show anxieties that gathered around Margaret, but they are not needed to explain Philip's reaction. The documented anchors are enough. The public photographs in 1976, the collapse of the Snowdon marriage, and the realization that Margaret's private life could no longer be separated from the Crown's public standing. 2 years after those photographs appeared, that private collapse became official. By 1978, the collapse was no longer background strain. Margaret and Lord Snowdon divorced, after years in which the marriage had already been damaged in public view. For the family, the legal ending mattered because it turned private failure into official royal fact. A princess, the Queen's sister, separating from the respectable structure that had once steadied her image. Timing made the danger worse. Britain in the 1970s was less deferential, economically strained, and more willing to ask what the monarchy cost and what it gave back. The civil list made royal conduct politically sensitive. If the family asked the country to fund dignity, ceremony, and service, then photographs of disorder and headlines about marital collapse became ammunition for critics who believed the institution was out of step. Philip's reaction is easier to understand without turning him into a simple scold. His public life had been built around restraint, naval service, constant engagements, and a long effort to make the royal household look modern enough to survive, but disciplined enough to deserve survival. Margaret's visibility cut across that story. She weakened the narrative that the Windsors lived by sacrifice when the country was being asked to respect and support them. The consequence fell most heavily on Margaret. Divorce did not erase her title or remove her from the family, but it altered her position inside it. The central line of duty ran through Elizabeth, Philip, and the heirs. Margaret increasingly stood to the side, still royal, still visible, but less useful to the image the palace needed. Her freedom had been real. So was the cost. The island that promised distance from control led back to the same wall: public proof, public money, public judgment, and a family that closed ranks when survival was at stake. At the end, the fracture is clearer than the private emotions behind it. The evidence does not give us a private confession from Philip, or a single document proving exactly what he felt toward Margaret in those years. It shows a collision between a princess reaching for room to live and a royal system Philip had spent decades trying to discipline into survival. The Moustique photographs were documented. The divorce was documented. The public anxiety around royal funding, respectability, and relevance was documented. The inference is narrower, but still powerful. To someone formed by service, restraint, and institutional repair, Margaret's rebellion was dangerous because it made the family's private contradictions impossible to hide. Margaret did not destroy the monarchy. The crown endured by absorbing scandal, closing ranks, and moving attention back to duty. But endurance had a human cost. Margaret remained royal, while the logic of the institution pushed her further from the line that mattered most. So the story is not simply that Philip was unforgiving or that Margaret was reckless. Inside the Windsor family, freedom could exist only while it did not threaten survival. When the two came into conflict, survival won. For more evidence-led royal history, this is Palace Scandals.